This is a meeting remembering Blair Peach. It was in April 1979, 35, God, how is that? 35 years ago, that Blair Peach was murdered by the SPG. He was murdered at a counter-demonstration to, and I should say, a special patrol group for those of you below the age of 40. These were the kind of armed wing, really, of the London police at the time. And it was a protest demonstration because the National Front, very provocatively, had called a public meeting in Southall in the heart of the Bengali community. Punjabi community, sorry. Okay, and Blair was an active SWP member, he was active in the NUT, and he was active in the then Anti-Nazi League. So the first person I'm going to call to speak, and I think people will know, the speakers will speak, and then we'll open it up to the floor on a show of hands for people to make contributions. The first person who's going to speak is Jo Lang, and she was a teacher, a colleague and comrade of Blair's, and she will talk about Blair Peach. I'm also going to ask John Lockwood to speak for 5 minutes or so about the build-up, really, Lewisham, the famous, the famous altercation and protest at Lewisham against the National Front, and then we have Balwinder Singh.
Balwinder Rana.
Sorry, I should get my Balwinder Rana, who's going to speak really about the experience of building the anti-fascist struggle in the area. So I'm going to start by Jo.
Good morning, comrades. Thank you for coming to the meeting. Now, as Jan said, Blair was killed in 1979 on the 23rd of April. No one has ever been brought to justice, no one has ever been on trial, no one has been disciplined, and there has never been an official public inquiry into the events in Southall, which were much bigger than just the death, obviously, of Blair Peach. Blair Peach was killed in Southall, but I wanted to talk a little bit about who he was and why he was so important to the struggle in East London in particular. Blair was a teacher. He came from New Zealand, and he worked in a special school in Bow called Phoenix, which at that time was designated as a school for children who were delicate, those children who had physical disabilities and illnesses. He was a socialist, and that's very important to his whole story, I think, and a member of the SWP. He was also a leading activist in the NUT in East London. At the time of his death, he was actually president of East London Teachers Association. As a man, he was very funny, he was very sharp, he was very intelligent, he was very complicated, as most people are. He was a great teacher who really inspired his students. And he had, for those of you who knew and remember him, a terrible stammer. Not that that actually ever stopped him from getting up at a meeting and speaking. As Jan says, by his own admission, he was not a street fighter. But he always found the courage and he always found the confidence to confront racists and, in particular, the National Front. In 1977, and this sounds like ancient history to a lot of people, when I first got to know Blair, the East End was a very different place. And in particular Brick Lane. I worked in the primary school in the middle of Brick Lane. And although Brick Lane is now a kind of shishi place where you go and eat ciabatta and look at artworks, at that time it was extremely poor. It was very run down. There was terrible housing. The children that I taught lived in these estates, Chicksand Estate in particular, and it was, I don't know the last time any work had been done on it. It was also a focus for racists. It was a focus for the National Front's activities. The NF were trying to intimidate, to harass, to humiliate the community in Brick Lane. And at that time, and it still is obviously, a very Bangladeshi area. The school I worked at was actually almost 100% Bangladeshi. And it was obvious to all the teachers in the school and in the area that we couldn't just stand by and watch what was going on. We had to organise. we had to organise some kind of fight back. That is not to say, and I think this is very important, that the community were passive. They weren't, not at all. The Bengali youth movement was organising, and we had regular contact and meetings with them, and that was us trying to work as the ANL, as the Socialist Workers Party, with the local community. And Blair was absolutely central to the organising against the National Front. He was the one, and he was a very, in a kind of quietish way, very powerful person. And he was always the one who got us out doing some things. Picketing, leafleting, going to meetings, talking to people. He really was tireless in his commitment to organising. And I think that is extremely important. And it got to be very difficult because not only were we trying to organise against the National Front, we got harassed a lot as well personally. You stood on a paper sale then, you needed to be prepared either to hide or run away, in my case. Right, Blair had a long record of anti-racist action. For example, in 1974, it's almost inconceivable now, but he was campaigning. There was a pub that refused to serve black customers. He was trying to get it closed down. Now we think, how could that be? But that's the sort of backdrop to what we were organising around. So in the context of his commitment to anti-racism, both working within school and the community, going to Southall was just part of that process. Now, as you will remember, in 1979 there was an election. Thatcher got elected. And in the build-up to that election, there were a whole number of demonstrations against the National Front because what they were doing, as Jan alluded to, was trying to provoke. They would try and have a meeting in an area where they knew there were lots of ethnic communities. And they would therefore be allowed to have a meeting, which led to huge confrontations. Now, Balwinder will talk about what happened in Southall much more on the day. I'm just going to focus on what happened to Blair. So on the Saturday before Blair was killed, I went to Leicester. There was a huge demonstration there, and the NF got a real pasting. If any of you were there, it was a joy to see. Yeah. But what happened as a result, I think, was that, well, A, they let the dogs out. They actually had police dogs off the leads running after us. But also, the police were very angry and very frustrated at what had happened. Now, also, just prior to that demonstration, and in that period that I went to my first NUT conference, at which Blair came to as an observer, we proposed affiliation to the Anti-Nazi League. Sadly, that didn't go through now, but fast forward 35 years, one of the strongest supporters of United Against Fascism is the NUT. So lots has changed. So I'm just going to focus a little bit about what happened in Southall on the day and what happened as a result. We went to Southall. It was impossible to get anywhere near the demonstration near where the NF were trying to get into the town hall. In those days, we didn't call it that, but we were kettled. We were kept in the Broadway for hours. I mean, literally 4 or 5 hours. At the end of that period, the police removed their cordons and we decided to go home because it had been raining, we were tired, we'd been pushed around. You know, I thought, like everybody else did, it was just another day of trying to show solidarity with the community. None of us, especially Blair, had gone there with the idea that somehow we were going to do some heroic action that was going to get us arrested and injured. So, when we left the demonstration, we turned away from the Broadway and the SPG arrived and charged. Now, when I say charged, they had their truncheons, their shields, and they charged. Now, it was a narrow street, so the only option really was to turn away and run. So we did. And I got to the bottom of the street. Blair wasn't there. Thought, well, okay, better go and look for him. I went back up the street, couldn't find him, so I started asking people, have you seen my friend? No, he looks like this. A family said to me, who I later learnt were the Atwells, said there's someone in our house who's been injured, do you want to come and see if it's your friend? And it was Blair. And at that point he was still conscious, he didn't have any obvious injury, and the family very kindly were trying to reassure us, saying, don't worry, it'll be okay, we've called an ambulance, you know, it'll be okay. So by the time I got to the hospital, Blair was taken in an ambulance, the police were already there. They knew, I am convinced, they knew what they'd done, right from the off. And they wanted to talk to us, and we thought, no, we're not going to speak to you right now, because we had just seen our friend injured and taken to the hospital. We waited, and then we were told, it's going to be a while, you best go home. So we went to a friend's house. By 12 o'clock that night, after a couple of phone calls, we were told, but over the phone, that Blair had died. Now, at that moment, we also realised we had to tell other people that he died. It was a very difficult situation to find yourself in. In the middle of all of this, Commander Cass arrives. Now, Commander Cass was a senior police officer who was charged with an internal investigation. He came, he wanted Blair's clothes. We gave him his clothes. We didn't give him his address book. And as I say, none of us had gone there with the intention of injuring anybody. But at the time, David McNeill, the commissioner for the Met, had a very different view. He said, and he was speaking to a black journalist at the time, but if you keep off the streets of London and behave yourselves, you won't have the SPG to worry about. In other words, shut up and stay in your houses, let the racists do whatever they want, and you'll be okay. He also said that I'm of the opinion that if a person is part of a crowd throwing missiles, then that is collective support. So we were fair game for them. Now, the Cass investigation showed up all sorts of things, like Nazi memorabilia in SPG members, lockers, the fact that they said Blair had been hit by a lead-filled Hosh, not a truncheon. They had whips. I mean, you know, whatever you could imagine pretty much was turned up. Now, they narrowed it down to 6 names, and they knew from a few weeks after the event who killed Blair Pitch. Murray, Lake, Scotto, Richardson, Firestone and White were all in that van, and Murray, almost certainly, even by the police's admission, struck the blow. Now, I just want to conclude, because we're running out of time. I want to just quote from this very good pamphlet that I hope you will buy, that from something Amanda Leon wrote, who was with us at the time. She said, but when the Blair Peach died, it quickly became apparent that a whole new wave of people suddenly found out 3 things. That the police will do whatever is necessary to impose the establishment will, so what's new? That a fight back is possible, that direction and organisation are needed to bring the issues and the fight to the front pages and to ensure that anyone caught up by racism is not alone. So if you remember nothing else, those 3 things are a pretty good place to start. And finally, I'd like to just quote from something that Tony Cliff said at Blair's funeral. Speaking at the graveside following his funeral, Tony Cliff, the founding member of the SWP, declared, Blair identified himself with all the oppressed, with the physically weak children, with black people, with women, with low-paid workers. His heart was with the exploited and the oppressed. It is no use building monuments of brass and stone. Let us mourn, but let us organise and mobilise. And those words, I think, sum up what we have to continue doing. So if you're not a member of the UAF and you're not out there combating UKIP, make sure you join up today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jo. That really set the scene. And now I'm going to ask John, who's just going to speak for 5 minutes about the Lewisham.
Okay, I wanted to start by saying that the last time that I ever spoke to Blair was on a paper sale at Whitechapel, and in the course of this paper sale, as so often happens, we were attacked by fascists, and there were 3 or 4 of them and 2 of us, and so we did the best that we could to return a few punches. It was very unpleasant, but very quickly over. And as we gathered the papers that had been strewn across the street and retired to lick our wounds and tell exaggerated stories to our friends, Blair said to me, "You know, I'm no good at this. I'm no good at the street fighting." Now, I don't know if he imagined that I was, but, you know, the truth is none of us were. Very, very few of us were street fighters. We recruited street fighters like the Nazis recruited intellectuals. That's the truth of the matter. Our strength was in the collective, and it really shaped how we were to organise, because going back now from that day, which was just the week before Blair was killed, the way that we organised through Wood Green and through Lewisham, and I don't have time to do all the details, but a central part of that organisation was an argument about the right to confront the Nazis, as opposed to an idea which many decent people, for want of a better word, felt, which was that there was an absolute right to freedom of speech. And what do you do then when you've got an absolute right to freedom of speech directly contradicted by the right and freedoms of people to walk the streets unmolested? That's the sense. That's the question. That's where that notion of an absolute right breaks down. This was blown out of the water by the stabbing of a young lad in Southall, Gudip Singh Shagar. Hope I've got the name right. And it blew it out of the water because immediately after that, a Nazi called Kingsley Reid made a speech in which he said, "That's one down, 2 million to go." Now, that's pretty clear what he meant by that. That was contrary to the new Race Relations Act. He was prosecuted, and the judge said, he exonerated him, and he said, "I wish you well in your project." Now, he didn't. The judge didn't say whether the project in which he wished him well was the building of a Nazi party or the extermination of Asian people in Britain. He wasn't clear about that, but he wished him well in his project. That completely blew out of the water the idea that you could rely on the state and that this nicety of absolute freedom of speech. From that point on, I think, the whole argument changed. And we argued really hard. We have to confront these Nazis in overwhelming numbers. And we began to win that argument on the basis of that. But what really wins arguments is not so much a rational, well-delivered argument. What wins the argument ultimately is proof in practice. And on the day, 13th of August, 1977, we, for the first time since 1936 in Cable Street, for the first time, we militarily defeated not only the Nazis, but the forces of the state. That was a magnificent day. Now, it ended badly for me, I have to say, because on that day, I was elected to the organising group that had built the morning demonstration. I was known by police. I was recognised, chased down, run down by a police motorcycle, beaten up, the bones in my hand broken, arrested, charged with police assault, ultimately convicted, imprisoned for 3 months, and in prison I faced death threats from Nazi screws. So it didn't end well for me that day. However, it was a magnificent day, and we built on that day because subsequent to that we launched the Anti-Nazi League. And if I've got just enough time, 1 minute, have I got 1 minute?
Yeah.
On that day of the 30th of April, 1978, I was in prison. On that day we were locked, the whole prison was locked down. They said the shortage of staff, I don't know whether it was that or something else. But on that day, having been threatened by Nazis, they were taunting me through the cell door. And some of this is quite astonishing, some of my fellow prisoners started to support me. Now it is astonishing because almost all of these guys were, let's say, significantly influenced by racism, right? I wouldn't say out and out racist because what I'm going to say proves the opposite, but they were significantly influenced. As the day went on and announcements were coming through on the radio, 10,000 people at Victoria Park, 20,000, 30,000. As these reports came through, my mates on the wing started shouting, "Red John, that's your mates out there!" And the screws who'd been taunting me through the door disappeared off the wing. But it continued. 40,000 in Victoria Park, 50,000 in Victoria Park, and the guys started to bang their metal cut onto the pipes. Now that's a sound which you won't ever hear unless you're incarcerated, but I can tell you it's astonishing. The whole wing rings with the resonance of the pipes as people bang on them. And it also, this wasn't so much support for me as hostility to the screws, and that's an important thing. But on that day, the events, as it built up to 100,000 people in Victoria Park, there was a crescendo of noise on the wing of people shouting and cheering. And I think the way that I interpret this is that the impact of that 100,000 people marching through the street was way more than just the impact on the 100,000. Waves of collectivity passed through the streets of London, even down into the depths of despair in the dungeons of the state. And it lifted the heads of the most cowed and the most demoralised and the most miserable people. So that just for a minute, there was that sense of anti-racist collectivity amongst people who were quite influenced by racism themselves. I'm choked to say it, actually, because it was a dramatic... That's something that I've carried with me ever since, and will carry to my grave.
Before. That was fantastic. Okay, and now we're going to go to Balwinder, who's going to talk about Southall. You're going to the mic, Balwinder.
Yeah, thank you, comrades, friends. Is this channel?
Yeah, it's on.
This one. Nice. Okay. Yes, 35 years ago, and for those of us who were there on the day, and it looks like quite a few of us from here were there on the day, it still seems like yesterday. And but I want to take you back before that time to 1979. That's that time when I actually became actively involved in the anti-fascist struggle. And that was after the Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech in '68, when throughout the country a wave of racist attacks has spread through, which the mass media at the time, the right-wing media, disgustingly called the Pecky bashing. And at the time I lived in Gravesend, and some of the youth, since I was a young man at the time, we got together to oppose the racist attacks, and we formed an Asian youth organization called the Indian Youth Federation, and that was the very first Asian youth organization in this country, and I was the founding president of that. After that, in 1974, the National Front, who had been formed from a very small group of the fascists, they held the very first major rally in London in Conway Hall, Red Lion Square. And outside there was a massive protest for the anti-racist. And as usual, the police attacked the anti-racists. And a young student called Kevin Gately from Warwick University got killed after being trampled under a police horse. A few months after that, in Leicester, the National Front held their very first march, and there was a counter-protest against the National Front. And we from Gravesend took a coach load to support the counter-protest. And that's when I joined the SWP, or the IS as it was now. And also there are comparison between now and then, because 1974 was also a year of very deep economic crisis. Just like now, or 2007, there was mass unemployment, people losing their homes, their jobs, and the then Labour government had introduced austerity. And also the media, the right-wing media, was just like in the last few years, they were blaming the immigrants, us, for all the problems. They were almost daily basis, there were lurid headlines like the immigrants flooding this country, either were working too hard and taking away white workers' jobs, or were too lazy just to be living on the benefits. And this had led to the tremendous increase in tremendous support for the fascist National Front. And they have started marching in their thousands. In fact, mainly through the black and Asian areas. In fact, some of the marches could be quite frightening because I'm sure, again, many people here remember that almost always they'll have their spear carriers in the front, so-called honor guard, with the Union Jacks tipped with the spears, and behind them there will be some band playing. Then thousands of them, many of them skinheads, giving their customary Nazi salutes, and it could be quite a frightening spectacle. And that had led to a vast increase in the number of racist attacks around the country. As already mentioned, south of Gharib Chaggar, in 76, a young lad was knocked to death by a racist gang in Southall, and that had led to the explosion in the community and led to the youth organizing themselves to fight against the racists. Similarly, in Brick Lane area, East London, 3 murders took place within that many months: Altab Ali, Ishaq Ali, and Candace Singh. And similarly, the youth began to organize in Brick Lane, East London, and in Newham and Bradford, various other places. Again, there are similarities that, just like now, when the idiot truck march, there's always debates and discussions how be the best way to oppose them. Same was happening in those days as well. The people, when the National truck march, there were always groups meeting and anti-racists and trying to decide what's the best way. And some people say that we should ignore them, they will go away. And others argue that we should hold a counter-protest maybe on a different day or a different time, different place. And our argument was always that we have to confront them on the streets. Now, I can remember some meeting, I think it was in Leicester, when some vicar stood up and said, oh no, we don't have to march on a different day, we don't have to march in a different place, we should gather on the route of the National Front where we're going to march. But when their march goes past us, we should all turn our backs to them and shout, "Woo to the National Front." But when we said we want to confront them on the streets, I don't think exactly that's what we meant. And in fact, we proved that quite correctly, as already been explained by John, in Lewisham, where we actually stopped them from marching. But I think John's given a very good explanation about Lewisham. I just want to add one thing, that Lewisham actually came on the back of Grunwick strike. And Grunwick strike was, as I'm sure we remember, that thousands of workers from all around the country used to come to support a handful of Asian, mainly women, in the north of London. And I can remember there's the miners from Wales, miners from Yorkshire, other workers, and for many, many weeks, although we again remember that the strike was actually defeated by their own union, and how they sort of shared on the workers. But that was what had given a tremendous confidence to the working class. And as a result, in Lewisham, the workers came from all over the place, from Birmingham, Bristol, all over, and there were thousands of us, and also thousands of black youth turned up to stop the National Front from marching. Again, the police attacked the anti-racists as usual, and in fact I can remember some police singing, "There ain't no black in the Union Jack." And the black youth replied, "Red, white and blue, we shit on you." Soon after that, the anti-Nazi League was launched, and again, John explained very well. One thing I just like to add, it was a united front between the
Two more minutes.
Oh, sorry. Anyway, then came Southall. In Southall, it was a couple of weeks before the National Front march, the meeting, we discovered that they were going to come right to the heart of our community, basically to insult our community. And the Indian Workers Association at the time, they immediately called a meeting of the whole community. They asked people to send 2 delegates per organization, and at the meeting there were 80 people representing religious organizations, trade unions, women's organizations, youth, almost whole spectrum of the local area was represented. At the meeting, we decided that we want to hold, first of all, raise a petition, then present the petition to the Ealing Council 1 day before their meeting, which was on a Monday. And then to ask the council to ban their rally. If that does not happen, then on Monday have a protest, a peaceful protest outside the town hall where they were going to meet. This meeting, they also elected a committee to organize all those things, and I was one of those 5 members of the committee. And then the committee further appointed me the chief steward for those demonstrations. Actually, it was a 3-day event. Like Saturday was in Leicester, sorry mentioned, where I got arrested myself in Leicester. Sunday, then 5,000 of us marched all the way from Southall to Ealing to present a petition to the council asking to ban the rally the next day. And the police attitude was quite clear from that day, because they arrested 20 of people on the way, and they harassed us all the way. On Monday, since the rally was going to be at 7:30, and we had called for a strike at all the places around the South, all the factories, the airport, etc., from 1 o'clock. And also we had asked all the shops to close at 1 o'clock. But we expected that the next front, the rally 7:30, police will not come until later, because our plan was to hold a peaceful protest around the town hall from 5 o'clock. But to my surprise, the police started arriving at 9 o'clock in the morning, and there were thousands of them. In fact, it's the government figures, they should show that there were more than 3,500 police on there. And they generally they occupied town, just like in Belfast, other places they used to do. They have cattle the whole town. They set up these road blocks half a mile, a quarter mile away from the town hall. And no one was allowed to come into that area. Even the people could not go to their own homes. And when people tried to protect, then eventually people came and there were thousands of people at those road blocks. And when the time of the meeting came, people wanted to go near the town hall and make a protest. But the police attacked them quite brutally. First of all, they unleashed the dogs, and the dogs were chasing people. The people run back, they come back again. Then the police on horseback, they were chased into the crowds at high speed, hitting people over the heads with their long sticks. Then the SPG vans will drive at us at high speed. Then they'll get out of the vans, jump out, and the snatch squads will arrest young people. A lot of people were injured, a lot of people, in fact 700 people were arrested. Out of them, 352 were charged, and a lot of them paid fines, some even went to prison. And so those 700 people who were arrested, the police from all over the place, Reading, Slough, various other places, they would take them and they left them on the motorways, Reading, etc. People had to walk all the way back. And another person, Clarence Baker, was quite badly injured as well. He luckily survived. But of course, we know our friend, our brother, Blair actually was killed by the police on the day. And he still is remembered as a martyr, a hero in Southall, and I'm sure you will always remember that. Thank you.
I wasn't on the Southall demonstration where Blair Peach was killed. The reason I wasn't was I was on the one at Leicester 2 days earlier, which Balwinder referred to. Because you have to remember that the National Front rallies at the time and the counter demonstrations were part of the run-up to the 1979 general election when Thatcher got elected. And it was the whole part of the National Front's project to make themselves a respectable part of the furniture and for us to get used to them, hence the police reactions. What I remember about the Leicester demonstration was I was in Cambridge at the time. We booked a coach to go to Leicester. We were told, we discovered the day before that under pressure from the police, the coach had been pulled. We managed to get hold of a rented minibus. We knew we wouldn't be able to get into the city without being stopped by the police, so I went along to the public library, found paper copies of local bus timetables for Leicester. So we piled into this minibus, stopped at a small village outside Leicester, and took the local bus, having walking around this village trying to look incognito, piled into this bus, got into the centre and were able to take part in the demonstration. And those people under 30 who might not remember pre-internet, pre-mobile phone days, we had telephone trees. Those of us lucky enough to have landlines, and that's how we communicated. And yes, we stopped the National Front from their planned march in Leicester, so it was a success, but the whole thing made the national news. Would have become more prominent were it not for the effect in Southall 2 days later. So there was a lot of that going on around the country at the time. It was part of the whole series. The other point I want to remind people, what memory from the time, it was at the time that Thatcher made her now infamous remark about people being scared of foreign cultures. And a lot of people, even on the left, can sometimes believe that it was that defused the National Front vote and the Tories stole their thunder. It wasn't that. It was our demonstrating and our carnivals that really set them back.
Andrew Smith, Lewisham, SWP. Yeah, I wasn't at Southall either. I couldn't be there. I would have liked to have been there, but I wasn't actually in the country at the time. I was teaching in Sweden. It suddenly occurred to me at this meeting why I was in Sweden. I went there for a break. I'd had too much of the fascists. You know, I was another street coward. I actually had fascists complaining that I smoked in the classroom at school, but I also had the paper snatched out of my hand. I was at Lewisham. I was also at Grunwick's actually, where I was arrested, but I was at Lewisham, and I remember that day, and I remember the sort of gentle, kind police sergeant, because I take the point that you made about the role of the police in the state, and Audrey Farrell wrote very explicitly about that, and I think Claire Dissington, I don't know whether she's done her meeting or not, but people need to know about the police. But this police sergeant had a brick land on his helmet, and he staggered forward, and we told him to get out of it because he wanted to go back into the fray. But I also remember down in Lewisham that day there was a riot policeman with his shield who boasted about his father being a black shirt during the 1930s. All I want to say, because this looks a bit of an elderly meeting to me, but and I wish there were more young people here, but I'm sure that they are at other important meetings, and they will go to meetings about Greece and about the rise of fascism in France and all the rest of it. The only other thing I want to say is I did know Blair, and he was everything that people described. And I remember before I went to Sweden, I mean, I haven't had the chance actually really, I get a bit choked to say goodbye to Blair, because I was phoned in Sweden by a friend, Dave White, who's saying, isn't it terrible about Blair? And I had heard about the demonstrations, and I knew what was going on. And anyway, to cut a long story short, I did come back for the funeral, but of course the funeral was cancelled. I had to go back, and I never actually made a funeral. But the last thing I want to say, I don't want to indulge myself, but in 1978, I went out about 4 or 5 times with Blair in Merton. He came and spent some time with me. We went out drinking with a friend of his called Andrew Coulthard, and I think Ken Warple came once, and I don't know why he came to me, probably because I wasn't a street fighter either. And the one thing he did ask me is, should I join the SWP? And I just said, yes, you should Blair. So obviously people have been doing the right thing and been put a lot of pressure on him.
Okay.
Yes, I wanted to talk about Blair, about his work with teachers, because I was one of 7 teachers that was sacked back in the 1970s after a vicious campaign against us by the press, and it seemed like absolutely everyone at William Tyndale School. And Blair was absolutely central to our defence campaign. And he was not only there with the leafleting, there whenever he could, when he wasn't working on the picket lines, etc., and, you know, there at the meetings, but he became part of our defence team as well, and actually spent a long time during our appeal at the various sessions we had and defending us. Now, we were all a strange mixture of people at that school, and I myself had not been terribly politically involved, saw myself as a bit of a lefty, and that was it. And it was through Blair and other comrades that I got convinced I should be going on the anti-NF demonstrations, which I did, and I remember that you were talking about Leicester. And of course the thing was, it seemed like we were going almost every weekend somewhere. And of course the thing is, you're on a coach and everybody's talking to you, and I remember having conversation with Blair about struggle and about fighting racism, etc. And of course eventually did get convinced to join the SWP. But I just think that what is so important is that people like Blair make such a difference, because yes, we changed through struggle, and I certainly changed through struggle, but the other reason I changed was because there were people like him who was there not just to argue with me, but also to say, you know, come on this demonstration, do this, do that. And then I joined the SWP, and, you know, 35 years later, whatever, I'm still here. And I just think it's really, really important that we remember this about people and the role that we can all play in actually building against fascism, against racism, but also building, you know, for a better society, etc. And I think that's very important about him.
Yes. John talked about a number of people significantly influenced by racism, and I was one of those people when I was a lot younger who was quite influenced by racism, to say the least. Where I grew up, most of our mates, including me, were fairly racist, and we were well, my best friend joined the National Front at Southall, right? And long story short about that, lots of people's parents who were around the front were in the front. Some were in the Honour Guards. It was a big thing to be in the Honour Guards in that part of London. It was, you know, it was a prized thing amongst certain families. And there were families who traced back to Mosley's day. There was a real tradition there. I was thinking about teachers. Obviously, there's a lot of teachers here, rightly so. To be honest, we made our teachers' lives hell, frankly, where we were, for lots of reasons. We were rather wild young people, and we were around the National Front. Although the contradiction of it was that we loved the music that they hated. So we loved, at the time, the forerunner to Love Music Racism. Oh, right, we went to the gigs, you know, the Ruts from West London, Southall, Misty. I remember seeing Misty in the Ruts at a Ra gig. We would get argued with by people, including our teachers, who we were terrible to, frankly. One of the things that did it, I won't go into all the details, and before I forget, I want to thank what Brian Richardson and Nick have done with the pamphlet, other people have done with the pamphlet, it's fantastic. But the experience of being at Southall, and to be honest, we weren't around the right side, but we saw some of our teachers who were. The experience of that and the experience of what happened to Blair Peach really done our heads in. And so through that, and through going to the gigs, and through going to Southall Defence Defence Fund gigs at the Rainbow, 2 nights running there were, the Clash, and all sorts of Pete Townsend, The Who, you name it, right? It really threw us open to different ideas. It threw our heads open, really, in massive ways. It changed us enormously, and we were skinheads and punks and all the rest of it, and it changed us hugely, to the extent that, you know, we fell out with friends and all the rest of it. And I think while Southall's a living thing, the tradition is a living thing, the memory's a living thing, we were fucking horrible, frankly, at the time. And we could easily have we got asked to join the British movement, whatever it was, one of the real Nazi sects. And we were proud to be later on in life, not far later on in life, be called race traitors and all the rest of it by people we thought had something to say. And I still see some people now from then, quite a few people. Most people went away, you know, it was a horrible thing to say, it was a bit of a fashionable thing to be around the front because of street fighting and stuff. My best mate who joined the National Front later on in life, He's got 2 kids now, grown up. He married a mixed race woman. So people did change, people did change. And the teachers who we made lives hell helped to shape us a bit in all sorts of ways. And I think why it matters now is it still matters. I'm surprised at Bolton a few years ago, nobody died, the way the police were at Bolton, the UAF demonstration. I'm very surprised because, as people will know, remember, they went for people's heads, and that's the thing in the police code book. You hit someone on the head, there's obviously potential consequences. And I think what we're trying to do in UAF now, Joe and people, and Lovelies that hate racism and so on, is carry on that tradition. Obviously, as somebody said, it's 35 plus years on, different world in lots of ways. But it's a different world in some good ways. The industrial stuff, thank God, is mainly picking up, like the Grunwicks thing. There's also a different world because of some of the people in this room, and some of the people, unfortunately, aren't in this room anymore, aren't in this world anymore. The Judy Walsons, the Blair Peaches of this world, and the teachers who, like I say, now we have, we bump into each other now and again on occasion, and we have pleasant conversations. I think what people have done, as somebody just said, individuals do matter. And when there's a class, there's sections, the most militant sections, the class fight as well, that can shape things and turn young people like me, who are fucking all over the place, into hopefully slightly better human beings who have a better vision of the world and fight for it.
My name is John Whitsenfeld. Some of the people here know that I've been in the SWP for 55 years.
Really?
And
Still smiling.
how that works is that on the day that Blair Peach was killed, I was called out by the party to go along and see what I could do to help comrades and anybody there who was against the fascists, which I duly did. I got to the sort of place where they were preventing people from going through, but they let me through and told me where to go. That was to a black organisation that was organised in Southall, and so I asked them what they wanted me to do, and they told me to go along to this house that was in a road off Southall, which I'm not too familiar with, and give people in our party and other people who were fighting the fascists any help I could give them. So I duly did that, and to our surprise on that day we saw the police collect in a huge mass outside the house that we were in. I was stationed in a room there with a chap who later was very badly injured by the police, not the fascists, where they are often. And it was terrible. What was terrible about it was that I was able to give people help and advice. But then...
John, can I ask you, you need to say that you're a solicitor, so that people understand the help.
Yeah. Quite right.
Useful. Sorry to throw you.
Yes, I did. I'm not concerned with that anymore because I'm retired, but I would never forget this occasion. So I never met Blair Peach, but I did give evidence to the inquest that was not referred to very much by somebody will help me.
NCCL, the National Council for Civil Liberties.
Yeah, it was the person who
CAS report. Not CAS. Was it
the
police report or the unofficial?
Come on, let the man finish.
Yeah.
Go on.
They're only trying to help me, which I appreciate. And so I gave evidence to this chap from Oxford and told him what had happened to me, because the police wanted to get us out of the house where we were, and I was shoved out of the room, and I was hit on the head by a policeman with a truncheon. He had to reach a long way over to get me, but he did, and so it wasn't very pleasant. And since then, I've tried to sort of bring it to the attention of the police authorities, etc. And I discovered something that we don't very often hear about, and that was that the police officers who worked there did in fact all grow beards.
Yes.
I've never heard that happen before or since. I've always gone along on all the demonstrations in support of Blair Peach and in support of people fighting the fascists. And that's what we must do.
Sean Doherty, I was the NUT rep at Holloway School at that time. This meeting brings back so many memories, and it really is emotional. I mean, listening to Jackie, in Islington at the time, we were the left opposition to the NUT leadership in Islington and nationally, and had to fight like hell to get even the modicum of support for the teachers at Williamton. Now, listening to Balwinder describe the atmosphere on the morning of the day that Blair was killed, I was walking through Southall with Paul Holbrook, who was the secretary of the Anti-Nazi League that morning, and for several hours we were walking and saw streets getting blocked off by the police, and there was an eerie atmosphere. It didn't feel good. We felt that though we couldn't actually quite put our finger on it because we thought we were confident enough and had the right strategy to be able to break through. But the way in which the police occupied the area, and it fragmented the demonstration. So many of us were sort of shunted off in different directions, and eventually I went home and got a call the next morning that Blair had been murdered. But I just want to say one thing before that. I'd worked with Blair an awful lot on developing anti-racist policies in education, and I'm very proud to say that my school, Holloway, in February '78, a year and a bit before Blair's murder, had produced the first anti-racist policy of any London school, and that gradually got taken up by the National Union of Teachers. They actually then published it. But the campaign inside education and inside the NUT, and I'm glad Paul mentioned the teachers, because teachers were absolutely crucial to this, and made a massive difference to the way in which we approach fascism. Holloway's policy had two eyes in it: intervention and integration. We said we have to win the argument for confrontation with the fascists, number one, and number two, we had to integrate anti-racist policies into every area of the curriculum, which in those days we were able to do. We had a curriculum group which wrote the curriculum for the school, and we built in to every subject anti-racist strategies, anti-racist policies, and all the rest of it. So I'm very proud of being part of that tradition, and Blair worked very, very closely with me and with many other teachers in establishing that. And I think that this is a very fitting memorial to him, and I think the most important thing is that we not only never forget Blair, but that we carry on the struggle that he was central to.
I obviously wasn't around in the 70s, but I was just listening to speakers talk about what it was like then, because I live in East London, reminded me of something that because I live in Tower Hamlets, and because we had the local elections, American elections, there was a UKIP candidate, which was both hilarious and terrifying. But his wife said something that I heard it, I was like, what the fuck? What she said was, when we used to live around here, so this was 70s, 80s, 90s, we were all Cockneys and there was no racism. And this was like, and it was like, you had the National Front coming down Brick Lane beating people up, people out of Valley being murdered, and she sort of said, oh, there wasn't any racism. Like, that's not racism, but what is? Although, UKIP are not a fascist organisation, not arguing they do sort of, by scapegoating migrants, attacking 9 to Friday, saying you wouldn't want Romanians living next door to you. It does open up this, it's dragging politics further to the right, and although I think, UAF's done some great work opposing the EDL. We've had loads of demonstrations in East London to oppose them, really fantastic mobilisation for the whole community together. I do think it's important not only to keep challenging the EDL, but we also, it's really important to stand up to UKIP. So just a quick plug for this. 27th of September, stand up to UKIP demonstration in Doncaster, where, because they've done really well in the elections, we need to confront the scapegoating, and I think one of the best ways that we can sort of honour the memory of people like Blair Peach, who for racism and fascism, is to, obviously continue to oppose the EDL and oppose UKIP, and just send these bastards back to the stones under the stones that they called out from underneath.
Brian will be our last contributor, and then I'll get the platform to come back.
I wasn't on the demonstration in '79. I was 12, and I lived actually just west of London. I grew up in Windsor, but I do remember it from the time, because when Blair was killed, it was such headline news that it dominated the news agenda for a considerable period afterwards. And like so many people, I do feel quite emotional today seeing elderly, a venerable meeting, but I feel quite emotional because there are so many people who did participate and who have remained in the struggle, and it's a fantastic tribute that people have remained in the struggle. But we didn't write the pamphlet simply to be nostalgic. We wrote the pamphlet just to remember Blair, but also to talk about the method and the tradition and the way of struggling and organising, because it still matters today. I was at Glastonbury Festival a couple of weeks ago, and the Manic Street Preachers were headlining one of the bigger stages, and they played their song, "If You Tolerate This, Then Your Children Will Be Next," and they finished at the end of it. Nicky Wire, one of the band members, said, this song was about fighting fascism in the 30s. It can be done, and of course what he meant by that is that fascism we can struggle and we can defeat them, but of course we have to do it again, because we have seen a huge resurgence of fascism, less so in this country than elsewhere in Europe. And the reason it's less so in this country is because we knew how to organise. When people talked about how the National Front were beaten in the 1970s and 80s, that isn't just us saying it. Martin Webster, the national organiser, he exaggerated what he said, claiming that we were on the path to power. I was set to become Prime Minister, but actually the reason we were beaten was because the Anti-Nazi League organised, and every single time we tried to mobilise, they were there and they beat and battered us off the streets. That's what, he said it, so we should take it from him, not from those who say it was Thatcher and the Tories that marginalised the Nazis. And it was because we knew that method of organising, the optimism to think that we could mobilise massive numbers of people, trade unions, local communities, faith groups and so on. Of course it still matters today, because there are some people who argue that what you need to do is just to mobilise the street fighters, the ones who are confident to go and physically take them on. Well, sometimes that might work, more often than not it's not going to work, but we have I'll finish on this, Jan, we have an international responsibility, because it's so important to challenge and fight fascism across Europe. People look to unite against fascism. People look to the tradition of the Anti-Nazi League. We have a responsibility to encourage our comrades across the continent and elsewhere to learn the lessons that we learned way back in the 70s and 90s, and have repeated through Unite Against Fascism, that the best way to defeat fascism is to organise a real, concrete, proper united front. And also, as Joe finished, with that quote from Cliff, is that it's not enough to just beat the fascists. We have to destroy the system that gives them the opportunity to come back time and time again.
Yes, I think it's been really good to hear all those contributions from everyone, especially people who knew Blair really well. And I myself knew Blair very briefly in 1977, when the National Front used to sell their paper at the end of the Brick Lane, and the police had said that anyone who comes there first, they will give the pitch, so we used to start to oppose them. So we started turning up there on early morning on Sundays, and they start turning up as well. Then we start turning up on Saturday night, spending all night on the pavement. National Front started doing the same. Then we start turning up on Friday night, spending 2 whole nights on the pavement, so that we could be there first, and the police might move them away. And in those days, Blair was almost always there, so I got to know him briefly. But I think what I really want to talk about the last couple of minutes, that the similarities between now and then, because we have faced the same problem again, especially since the deep economic crisis of 2007. One thing has been different between how the EDL organized the National Front used to do then, because I think these fascists, before they probably used to have one cell in their brains, now they probably got 2, and they learned that rather than attacking us all at the same time, as they did, whether we were Hindus, Sikhs or Muslims, in the 70s they used to attack us all at the same time. Now they learn that rather than doing that, they use Islamic tactics. And that's why over the last few years they've been saying that only opposed to the Muslims. And sadly, some of our Sikh youth have fallen prey to their lies and deceit and have started to support the EDL. And that's why we had to launch the Sikhs against the EDL to oppose this propaganda and also try to dissuade any other Sikh youth from joining the EDL. And because of our campaign, our propaganda, and the ones who were actually supporting, especially the main leader, he resigned from the EDL, others left as well. So I think that's probably one lesson we have to learn, that the fascists can always try to divide and rule, but we have to be always united and expose their lies and deceit. And we say we are all whether we are black, white, whether we are Hindus or Sikhs, Muslims, we are all the same, and we should always fight the fascists. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to make one point really, which is picking up on Paul's very moving and brave contribution, and that linked, I think, to one of the points that I was making, which is that you come across people who have very conflicting ideas. And Tony Cliff used to put this very well. He used to say the working class has divided consciousness, and I heard him explain that on one occasion when he said, I'm not talking about this worker over here and this worker over here have different ideas. I mean, the one worker in the one head at the same time can believe completely conflicting and contradictory ideas. And we need to understand that, because that's how you get people who are profoundly affected by racism and damaged by racism. But it is still possible to argue with those people. At one end of the spectrum, you have hardcore fascists who we don't debate with. At the other end, there are people who are committed anti-racists who are clear. But most of the people in the middle, at some point in time, has conflict in their head and contradictory ideas. And those people need to be argued with. And I'll give a just final example, which was inspirational to me. In 1975, there was a racist in the town that I ended up living in Leamington Spa, a man called Robert Ralph, and he had a very famous notice board saying not for sale. Yeah. Robert Ralph became a cause célèbre on the Nazi right, although he was actually in the Ku Klux Klan. Years later, I met his daughter, who as a child had been dressed in the white thing and taken up onto the hill to burn crosses. That small child grew up into a woman who joined the anti-Nazi League. Oh, God. Now, that's wonderful. The sad part of it is that this woman was so badly damaged by her experience that she ended up using heroin and messed up and in prison. So it didn't end well. But that transformation is utterly inspirational, and we need to hold on to that sense of a possibility.
I just wanted to refer back to the Friends of Blair Peach Committee, because that was set up immediately after Blair was killed, and I think it was a very important organisation, because I think it became a kind of blueprint for how you organise and how you get justice. Now, I am still, as you can tell, extremely angry. And there has been no justice. But I can also look to other campaigns, like the Sean Riggs campaign that I got somewhat involved in. I think they took from us, to some extent, the way to work and to organise. And I think the Anti-Nazi League, again, is a blueprint, a model for how to organise. It drew in so many people. And Love Music, Hate Racism built upon the work of Rock Against Racism. And it's not being self-indulgent to talk about 35 years ago, but it's also wrong to be stuck in there, in that moment. The most important thing, I mean, there were people on this platform and Paul in Slough. Now that was a bit scary, trying to stand up against the EDL, and the reason it was scary was there weren't enough of us. There weren't enough people there, and That's the way we win. You all know that. That is the way we win. We have to get as many people, as Brian says, not just nationally, but internationally. That's who we are. We don't recognise race. We don't recognise nationality. We talk about the human beings as who they are. And as a teacher for 35 years, always in London, I saw a big change, and I was so happy about that. And I know my own kids do think differently. And I think everybody in this room who knows young people do know that they think differently. But that is precious, and we have to protect those ideas and fight for justice, freedom and equality.